Imagine a life full of trust, love, and faith, only to have it shattered by the very people you believed were there to protect you. Today, we share a story of strength and courage, a story of one woman's journey from fear to freedom. This is a tale that will touch your heart and make you reflect on the true power of truth and resilience. Stay with us, because this story is one that needs to be heard. I have 4 children with the pastor, and he claims to be their father. A small town's secret. In the quiet town of Charleston Ridge, nestled deep in the heart of the South, there was a place where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were like whispers carried by the wind, always just out of reach, but never truly forgotten. The town was small, and though it had its charm, there was something suffocating about it. The scent of jasmine and damp earth permeated the air during the summer months, mixing with the faint smell of baked bread from Mrs. Walker's bakery down the street. The sounds of crickets chirping on warm evenings, the distant calls of children playing in the streets, and the rhythmic church bells every Sunday morning filled the air, marking the heartbeat of the town. For Grace, growing up in Charleston Ridge had always meant living in the shadow of the Mount Zion Church. It loomed over the town like a mighty oak, its towering steeple reaching toward the heavens, standing as a symbol of strength, tradition, and most of all, unwavering faith. The church was the heart of the town, its influence seeped into every home, every conversation, every decision. And for Grace, it was no different. She had been raised in the pews of Mount Zion, her parents devout in their belief, her father, an honest, hard-working man, always with his head bowed in reverence during the long Sunday services. Grace had learned early that the way to be accepted, the way to belong in Charleston Ridge, was to embrace the faith wholeheartedly, without question. Her parents, Helen and Thomas, had been pillars of the community for as long as Grace could remember. Thomas was the quiet one, his hands rough from years of hard labor, but his heart devoted to the Lord. Every Sunday, after the service, he would sit with Grace on the porch of their modest home, looking out at the town with a sense of pride that only someone who had lived there their whole life could understand. Helen, on the other hand, was the epitome of Southern grace. She was the heart of their home, always preparing a meal, always ready with a kind word or a soft touch. She was the type of woman who found joy in the small things. The smell of fresh flowers in the garden, the sound of rain tapping against the windows, the way the sun filtered through the trees in the late afternoon. Grace often wondered if her mother had ever felt the weight of doubt that sometimes settled in her own heart. But for Grace, the burden of their faith was different. It wasn't that she didn't believe. She did, deeply. But as she grew older, she started to question things, question the world around her. She had been taught to be obedient, to trust the words of the pastor, to follow the rules without hesitation. And yet, something in the back of her mind began to stir. A small, quiet voice that urged her to look beyond the surface, to question the things that didn't make sense. It was a Sunday afternoon when Pastor Johnson's gaze first lingered on Grace in a way that made her heart race with unease. He had always been a towering figure in the town, powerful in both stature and presence. His deep, resonant voice filled the sanctuary every Sunday, making his sermons sound like the very word of God. His eyes, when they looked at you, seemed to see through to your soul, as if he could read every thought you had ever hidden. People called him a man of God, a messenger sent to lead them to salvation. And for the most part, the town believed it. His words were always sure, confident, and filled with a kind of divine conviction. It was the way the townsfolk followed him like sheep to the shepherd, and the way he carried himself that made everyone believe in his holiness. Grace had always admired him from afar. There was something magnetic about him. something that made him seem larger than life. But it wasn't until that afternoon, when he came to her family's home after church, that Grace began to feel the weight of his presence in a way that left her breathless with discomfort. He arrived unannounced, as pastors often did, especially when they needed to talk to someone about their spiritual journey. His long coat fluttered in the wind as he walked up the dirt path to their house, his face set in an expression of deep contemplation. Grace's mother, Helen, greeted him at the door, her voice warm with respect. Grace, who had been sitting by the window, glanced up to see him standing in their modest living room, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "Grace," Pastor Johnson said, his voice as deep and smooth as velvet, "the Lord has revealed something to me." Grace felt a chill run down her spine. She stood frozen in place, trying to maintain her composure as he took a step closer to her. "God has chosen you," he continued, his voice ringing with a kind of authority that Grace had never heard before. "He has chosen you for a divine purpose, a mission that will shape the future of our community." Grace blinked, trying to make sense of his words. "Chosen," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Pastor Johnson nodded solemnly. "Yes, my dear. You are special. The Lord has shown me that you are to be my spiritual partner." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, thick and suffocating. Grace's heart began to pound in her chest as she tried to process what he was saying. She glanced at her parents, whose faces were filled with awe and reverence. Her mother's eyes welled with tears of joy, and her father stood with his jaw slightly slack, as if in disbelief that their daughter had been chosen for such an important role. But for Grace, it was as if time had stopped. A cold dread settled in her stomach as she looked at the pastor. His gaze was intense, almost predatory, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She wanted to scream, to run from the house, to escape the suffocating weight of his words. But she couldn't. Not when her parents were looking at her with such pride, such belief, that this was the greatest honor of all. "You are a blessing," Pastor Johnson continued, his voice smooth as honey. "God has seen your purity, your obedience, and He has chosen you for a sacred purpose." Grace nodded numbly, unsure of what to say. Inside, a part of her screamed to be free, but she couldn't find the strength to voice her fears. As Pastor Johnson spoke of the divine mission ahead, Grace felt a heavy weight settling around her chest. This was not an honor. This was not a blessing. This was a cage, and she had just stepped inside. The pastor's visions. After Pastor Johnson's visit, the air in the house felt different. Grace could no longer look at her parents without feeling the weight of their expectations pressing down on her, heavy and suffocating. Each time she passed her mother in the kitchen, she could see the unspoken pride in her eyes. Every word from her father seemed laced with reverence, as though they were now seeing her not as their daughter, but as something chosen by God, set apart from the rest of the world. She could hardly breathe without feeling like she was suffocating under the constant gaze of their unyielding faith. The following weeks passed in a blur. Pastor Johnson began visiting more frequently, each time with an air of purpose and authority that left Grace feeling increasingly isolated. His visits were framed as spiritual guidance, but the more she spent time with him, the more unsettling they became. At first, his presence had seemed comforting, even powerful. He was a man of God, after all, and his words carried the weight of something sacred, something holy. But as time passed, Grace started to feel like a pawn in his hands, as if she were being shaped and molded into something she was never meant to be. One evening, Pastor Johnson arrived at their house just as the sun was setting, painting the sky with streaks of purple and orange. He was alone this time, without his wife Rebecca, who rarely came along on these visits. There was something in his eyes, something dark, something that made Grace's skin crawl as he stepped into their living room. His usual smooth demeanor was gone, replaced by an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. "Grace," he began, his voice low and steady, "I have received a revelation. The Lord has spoken to me again." Grace felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had been expecting him, but not like this. There was something in the way he said it, his words heavy with certainty, that made her heart race with unease. She knew deep down that this was not just about guidance or faith. There was more at play here, something she couldn't quite grasp yet. "God has shown me that our union is inevitable," Pastor Johnson continued, his gaze fixed firmly on her. "This is not just about you and me. This is about the greater good, about fulfilling God's will for our community. You have been chosen, Grace, and we will be together as husband and wife, fulfilling a divine purpose." Grace's breath caught in her throat. Husband and wife? The words hung in the air like an unspoken command, their weight crushing her chest. She felt like she couldn't breathe. A deep sense of dread washed over her as she fought to hold herself together. She had no idea how to respond, no idea how to voice the growing panic inside her. "I don't understand," Grace finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought you said this was a spiritual union, not marriage." Pastor Johnson's lips curled into a smile, but it was not a reassuring one. It was the smile of someone who had control, someone who knew he was shaping her future with each passing word. "Grace," he said gently, "this is not about a traditional marriage. It is a holy union, one that transcends the boundaries of worldly understanding. God's will is that we come together for the sake of His plan. This is our mission, our purpose." Grace's head spun. She wanted to scream, to run out of the house, to escape the suffocating presence of this man who claimed to speak for God. But the thought of disappointing her parents, of shattering the illusion of divine purpose they had placed on her, paralyzed her. They looked at her with such pride, such faith. How could she tell them the truth? That she felt like a prisoner, not a blessed child of God? "You will be honored, Grace," Pastor Johnson continued, stepping closer, his voice now smooth and hypnotic. "Everyone in the town will see our union as a sign of God's power. You will become a beacon of light, a symbol of the Lord's will for our people." Grace's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to keep her composure. The more he spoke, the more she felt the grip of fear tightening around her. She had known deep down that something wasn't right, but now it was becoming clear. This wasn't a blessing. It was manipulation. It was control. And she was being swept along, powerless to stop it. I don't know if I can do this," Grace said quietly, her voice shaking. Pastor Johnson didn't falter. He stepped forward, his hand reaching out to gently take hers. His touch sent a shock through her, a cold, clammy sensation that made her want to pull away, but she didn't. She couldn't. Not when her parents were in the next room, their faith in him unwavering. "Grace, my dear," Pastor Johnson said, his voice dripping with false kindness, "this is God's will. We have a duty to fulfill, a mission to accomplish. And you, Grace, are the one who has been chosen to help me carry out this sacred task. You will learn to understand, just as I did. All it takes is trust. Trust in me, trust in God." The last words echoed in her mind long after he left, reverberating through her thoughts like a drumbeat she couldn't silence. Trust. That was what he wanted from her. He wanted her to trust him completely, to believe in the illusion he had crafted, to surrender herself to his control. But Grace couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a divine mission. It was a trap. As the days passed, the weight of Pastor Johnson's words pressed down on Grace like a heavy stone. She began to withdraw into herself, retreating into the quiet corners of the house where she could be alone with her thoughts. The town seemed to close in around her. Every conversation, every smile, every glance from the people in Charleston Ridge seemed to remind her of the role she was now supposed to play. She was no longer just Grace. She was someone else, someone chosen for a mission she didn't understand and didn't want. Her parents, meanwhile, were blinded by their devotion. They saw this as a great honor, a blessing from God. They were proud of their daughter, proud of the role she had been given. They didn't see the fear in her eyes, the way her shoulders had begun to slump with the weight of the expectations placed upon her. They didn't see how she was slowly fading into someone she didn't recognize, someone she feared. The truth was, Grace had never felt more alone. The people who were supposed to protect her, to love her, were the ones who had handed her over to a man whose influence seemed all-encompassing. And she was trapped, unable to escape, unable to tell anyone the truth. Part 3. The Weight of Chosenness. The days that followed Pastor Johnson's visit felt heavier than ever before. Grace could feel her world shifting beneath her feet, like a slow-moving current that was slowly pulling her further from the shore of her old life. The quiet town of Charleston Ridge, once comforting with its simplicity, now felt like a suffocating box, and every day the walls seemed to close in a little more. Her thoughts were consumed by the weight of Pastor Johnson's words. She couldn't escape them. "You have been chosen." The phrase echoed in her mind, reverberating through her every waking moment, suffocating her sense of self. At first, Grace tried to hold on to the semblance of normalcy that had defined her life before Pastor Johnson's revelation. She continued with her chores, helped her mother in the kitchen, and tried to be the daughter her parents wanted her to be. But there was an unmistakable change in the air. Every glance, every word from her parents felt laced with unspoken expectation. They were proud of her, sure, but they were also blind. They didn't see the growing terror in her heart or the way her once peaceful home now felt like a prison. The worst part was that Grace couldn't talk to anyone about how she was feeling. Not her parents, not her friends. She had been raised to believe that the pastor's word was final, that God's plan was always right, even when it didn't make sense. "God's will is sacred," her father would say. "Trust in the Lord's guidance." That was what they had been taught their entire lives. And in their eyes, Grace was now part of that divine plan. How could she question it? How could she go against what they believed was a gift from God? But deep inside, Grace knew the truth. This wasn't a gift. It was a sentence. She wasn't chosen to help Pastor Johnson fulfill a divine mission. She was chosen to be a tool in his hands. She had been picked not by God, but by a man who saw her as nothing more than a means to an end. He wanted her, not as a spiritual partner, but as a possession, a prize to be claimed and controlled. The unease Grace felt every time she encountered the pastor grew stronger. He would smile at her with that predatory look in his eyes, that knowing smile that made her skin crawl. It wasn't a smile of warmth or kindness. It was a smile that made her feel like an object, something he could manipulate and use to further his agenda. And every time he touched her, whether it was a reassuring hand on her shoulder or a gentle grip on her wrist, she felt a cold shiver run down her spine. It wasn't just the pastor's actions that disturbed her, though. It was the way her parents, especially her mother, seemed to see her now. Her mother's gaze had shifted, as if she were looking at someone different. A woman, not a girl. There was awe in her eyes, yes, but also something else. A reverence that was almost unsettling. It was as though she no longer saw her daughter as the young woman who had played in the fields and laughed in the kitchen, but as a vessel, a means by which God's will would be carried out. Grace could see the pride in her mother's face, but she could also see something darker, an expectation, a pressure that was impossible to bear. Grace could no longer walk through the house without feeling like she was being watched. Her every movement seemed to carry a weight, as though her actions, her decisions, were no longer hers to make. Even the way she spoke had changed. She had learned to lower her voice when she answered, to make herself small and invisible, as if to appease the silent judgment that hung in the air. Her words, once free and light, had become carefully measured, as though she were walking on fragile glass. The silence between her and her parents grew. They no longer asked her about her dreams or her hopes. There was no talk of the future, no questions about what she wanted out of life. All the conversations seemed to revolve around the pastor, his plans, his visions, his guidance. Grace's own voice had been silenced, drowned out by the demands of the life they had chosen for her. One afternoon, as Grace sat at the window, watching the clouds drift lazily by, her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Pastor Johnson again. She had known it was only a matter of time before he came for her again. This time, though, something was different. There was an urgency in his step, a certain weight to his presence that made her stomach twist with dread. She had been dreading this moment since the first time he had set his eyes on her. "Grace," he said as he stepped into the house, his voice smooth and calm, yet with an undercurrent of something darker. "It's time we prepare for what lies ahead. The Lord has revealed to me that the time for our spiritual union is drawing near." Grace felt her breath catch in her throat. Her heart began to race, and her hands clenched at her sides. She wanted to run, to escape this nightmare that had become her life, but there was nowhere to go. Her parents would never let her leave, not now. Not when they believed she was fulfilling God's plan. The pastor's eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, Grace felt like she was falling into them, drowning in the intensity of his gaze. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and unyielding. It was the same touch he had given her before, gentle, reassuring on the surface. But underneath, there was power, a hidden force that made her feel small and insignificant. "You have been chosen," he said again, his voice low and steady. "This is your purpose, Grace. Do not fight it. Do not question it. You are to be my partner in this sacred mission." Grace tried to pull her hand away, but his grip tightened, holding her in place. She could feel her pulse racing in her chest, the blood rushing to her ears. She wanted to scream, to tell him that she wasn't the person he thought she was, that she didn't want this life, but the words wouldn't come. She was trapped. Pastor Johnson leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "This is not just a spiritual union, Grace. It is a bond that will last for eternity. The Lord has chosen you to walk this path with me, and together we will fulfill God's will for this town." Grace's mind was spinning. She didn't know what to say, what to do. The words chosen and divine were swirling around her like a storm she couldn't escape. She felt like she was drowning, and there was no way out. This wasn't a blessing. This wasn't a mission. This was control. It was manipulation disguised as faith. And she was being dragged into it, whether she liked it or not. The pastor released her hand, his smile still in place, and turned to leave. "We will talk again soon, Grace. And when the time comes, you will be ready." Grace watched him walk out the door, her heart heavy with fear and confusion. She was no longer just a daughter. She was no longer just a young woman with hopes and dreams. She was part of something much darker, something she could not escape. And for the first time, she understood the true meaning of the word chosen. The pastor's actions begin to feel wrong. Grace's world, once so simple and familiar, had begun to shift into something unrecognizable. It was like a dream that no longer made sense, one where she was both the observer and the unwilling participant. Each passing day felt like a step further into a nightmare she couldn't wake up from, and yet, the reality of it all kept pulling her deeper. The pastor's visits became more frequent, his presence in their home more dominating. Every time he spoke to her, Grace felt herself becoming smaller, like she was being whittled away, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of the girl she once was. The most disconcerting part was how everyone else seemed to be blind to the darkness that had begun to settle around her. Her parents, caught up in the honor of what they believed was God's will, could see nothing wrong. They spoke of Pastor Johnson with such reverence, as though he were the very embodiment of divine power. Every time Grace tried to bring up her feelings, her fears, her doubts, they dismissed them as natural concerns of a young woman grappling with an immense responsibility. "You're special, Grace," her mother would say. "God has chosen you for a purpose far greater than we can understand." But the more she heard it, the less it felt like a blessing, and the more it felt like a trap. The church, her home, and even the town of Charleston Ridge were all part of the same machine. Everyone was complicit, knowingly or unknowingly, in the world that Pastor Johnson had crafted, a world where his every word was law and his influence was omnipresent. The more she thought about it, the more she realized this wasn't just about faith. This was control. One evening, Pastor Johnson came to their home, unannounced as always, his footsteps echoing through the quiet house like thunder. Grace's heart skipped a beat. The last few weeks had been filled with dread every time he stepped through the door, and now she could feel the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. He smiled as he entered, but it was a smile that did nothing to reassure her. There was an urgency in his movements, a force in his presence that immediately made her uneasy. "Grace," he said, his voice smooth and deep, "we need to prepare. The time is drawing near for our union to be made public. It's time to make this official." Grace's stomach twisted at his words. "Official? What does he mean by official?" she thought, her mind racing. "You've known, of course, that our union will be a symbol of faith and obedience for this town," Pastor Johnson continued. "It's time for everyone to see that. We will hold a ceremony. You'll be at my side, just as God intends. This is how we will fulfill the Lord's plan." The room seemed to close in around Grace. She could hear the words, but they felt far away, like she was watching this scene unfold from somewhere outside herself. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but her mouth felt dry, her voice swallowed by the fear that had become so familiar. "Grace?" Pastor Johnson's voice cut through the fog in her mind. He was standing right in front of her now, his eyes locking onto hers with a level of intensity that made her feel small, like a child caught in a lie. He reached for her hand, and for a moment, Grace froze. She had been expecting this. She had seen him reach for her before, but now it felt different. It was no longer a reassuring gesture. It was a demand, a claim. His hand closed over hers, warm and firm, and she fought the urge to pull away. The touch felt wrong. There was a subtle pressure in it, an expectation that she be obedient. She wasn't sure how much longer she could pretend. She wasn't sure how much longer she could pretend this wasn't happening, that this wasn't her life now. "You're ready, Grace," Pastor Johnson said, his tone almost tender. I know it's a lot to ask, but you were chosen, and the Lord's plan will bring us closer to salvation." The words stung. They were a reminder of how powerless she had become. She had never asked for any of this, yet here she was, trapped in a life that no longer felt like hers. Grace began, her voice trembling, but she couldn't finish the sentence. Her mouth felt dry, her throat tight. She wanted to say that she wasn't ready, that she didn't want this life. She wanted to scream, to run away, to tell him everything she had been holding in for so long. But she couldn't. Her parents were in the next room, and their pride in her role in the pastor's plan, was suffocating. She could see it in their eyes. This was everything they had hoped for. To them, she was fulfilling God's will. But to Grace, it felt like a slow death. Pastor Johnson gave her hand a final squeeze, as if to reassure her that everything would be fine. But the moment his fingers left hers, the silence between them felt unbearable. It was as though the air in the room had thickened, filled with the weight of unspoken truths. Grace wanted to run. She wanted to tell him no. She wanted to say that this wasn't the life she had chosen, that she wasn't a vessel for his plans. But the fear that gripped her heart, the fear of what might happen if she did speak out, kept her frozen. Her parents would never forgive her. The town would never forgive her. Pastor Johnson's words had woven themselves so deeply into the fabric of the community that to go against him was to go against everything they believed in. "Grace," Pastor Johnson said, his voice softening, "you don't have to say anything now. But I need you to trust me. I need you to understand that this is bigger than both of us. The Lord has called us to do something important. You will see that in time." Grace nodded, though every fiber of her being screamed that this wasn't right. He was asking her to trust him. But how could she? How could she trust a man who had manipulated her? A man who used her faith and her fear to control her every action. And yet, in her silence, she realized just how much he had already succeeded in bending her will. As Pastor Johnson turned to leave, Grace stood motionless, her heart heavy in her chest. His words, his touch, and his presence had all but consumed her. She felt powerless, suffocated by the weight of his authority. But there was no escape. Not now. Not when her parents saw this as her purpose, her destiny. The door clicked shut behind him, and Grace stood there for a moment, still holding on to the remnants of his touch. A quiet sob threatened to break free, but she held it in, swallowed the pain deep inside where no one could see it. She had no voice here. She had no agency. And as the pastor's footsteps faded into the distance, the weight of her chosen path pressed down on her chest, suffocating her every breath. The hidden truth. In the weeks that followed Pastor Johnson's announcement of their impending union, Grace felt herself becoming increasingly isolated. The days blurred together in a haze of church services, housework, and conversations about the divine purpose she had been chosen for. Her parents, still beaming with pride, spoke endlessly about how blessed she was, how God had handpicked her for something special. Their words, meant to be comforting, felt like shackles tightening around her. Grace felt as though she were walking through a fog. Each smile, each gesture of affection from her parents made her feel more and more distant from herself. She was becoming something other than the person she had once been, someone molded by the expectations of others. The weight of their beliefs pressed heavily upon her, and she felt the growing terror in her chest whenever she tried to voice her concerns. The pastor's visits grew more frequent, and each one left Grace feeling smaller, more powerless. He would speak to her in that smooth, authoritative voice, telling her of their mission, of the greater good they were serving. Every word he spoke seemed to reinforce the idea that she had no choice in the matter. He had already decided her fate, and she had to follow along, for the good of the town, for the good of God's will. But in the stillness of the night, when everyone else was asleep, Grace couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in her gut. She had begun to wonder if there was more to the story, something she was missing, something everyone else was blind to. There had to be more than this. She couldn't accept that the pastor was right, that she was meant to live out her life in a union that felt more like a cage than a blessing. One evening, as Grace sat alone in her room, her mind racing with questions, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She couldn't continue down this path without knowing the full truth. She had heard whispers in town, rumors about Pastor Johnson's past, about the women who had come before her, the ones who had been chosen in years past. But Grace had always pushed those thoughts aside, too afraid to confront them. Now, however, she had no choice. She needed to know if this was truly God's will, or if she was merely the latest victim in a long line of manipulation. The house was quiet, save for the sound of the wind rustling the trees outside. Grace crept down the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. She moved silently through the hall, past the kitchen, and toward the small study where the pastor often spent his time when he wasn't at the church. She knew where he kept his papers, his books, the things that seemed to define him. It wasn't much, just a few shelves of books and a heavy oak desk, but it was enough. With a glance over her shoulder, Grace quietly opened the door. The room was dark, but she knew where everything was. Her eyes fell on the desk, where the pastor kept a small leather-bound notebook. It was the one he always carried with him, and she had often wondered what was inside. He never let anyone see it, never let anyone touch it. Tonight, however, she was determined to uncover its secrets. Her hands shook as she opened the drawer. She had to know. There was no turning back now. Inside she found not just the notebook, but something else. A small stack of letters, tied together with twine. She quickly grabbed them, her fingers trembling as she untied the string. She flipped through the papers, her heart racing with each letter she unfolded. They were from women, young girls, some of whom had names she recognized from the pastor's past sermons. Each letter was a confession of sorts, testimonies of how they had been chosen, how they had been told by Pastor Johnson that it was their divine mission to serve him. Each letter was a painful reminder of the power he wielded over them, the way he used faith as a weapon to manipulate and control. Grace's hands shook as she read. Sarah Ellen, Elizabeth, Mary Ann. Each name was a ghost, a warning from the past. These girls had been chosen, just as she had been, only their fates were different. Some had disappeared, moved away in the middle of the night, as if they had vanished without a trace. Others had left under different circumstances, but none of them had been free. The final letter she read was the most chilling. It was from a girl named Sarah Ellen, and it was written in a delicate, almost desperate hand. The letter spoke of her fears, of how she had been taken from her family, how she had been told she was chosen for a higher purpose, just like Grace. But Sarah Ellen's letter was different. She had written of her pain, of how the pastor's actions were not those of a holy man, but of a predator. She wrote of the isolation she had felt, of the coldness of the house, of the way Pastor Johnson would come to her at night, under the guise of spiritual guidance. Her final words struck Grace like a thunderclap. If anything happens to me, if I am lost, you must know the truth. He is not what he seems. He is not a man of God. He is using us, one by one, until we are no longer who we were before. The letter was signed with the name Sarah Ellen, the same name Grace had heard whispered in the town, the name she had always associated with the stories of girls who had disappeared. The realization hit her like a wave, crashing over her and leaving her breathless. She was not the first. She was not the only one. There had been others before her, others who had been manipulated, controlled, and discarded when they were no longer useful. Grace felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She stumbled back, clutching the letters to her chest. This wasn't God's will. This wasn't divine purpose. This was a lie. Pastor Johnson had been using his position, using his power, to manipulate and abuse young girls, to mold them into his idea of a holy union, to satisfy his own desires under the guise of faith. Tears filled her eyes as she realized the full extent of what had been happening. She had been chosen, yes, but it wasn't for anything holy. It wasn't for a divine mission. She had been chosen because she was vulnerable, because she was young, because she was easy to manipulate. She couldn't go back to the way things were. She couldn't pretend that everything was fine, that this was her fate. She had seen the truth now, and it was staring her in the face. And for the first time, Grace felt something stir deep inside her, a spark of defiance, a spark of hope. She would not be another name on that list. She had to get out. She had to find a way to escape the life that had been forced upon her. But for the first time, she knew that the truth was with her now, and it was stronger than anything the pastor could use against her. A silent witness. The days after Grace uncovered the truth in Pastor Johnson's ledger felt like a strange, suspended moment in time. Every action, every glance exchanged between her and her parents seemed weighted with unspoken words, with truths that could never be voiced. She moved through the motions of her daily life, making meals, tending to the house, attending church services. But all the while, a storm raged within her, a maelstrom of fear, confusion, and disbelief. It wasn't just the pastor who had failed her. It was her parents, too. They had given her over to him, believing that what they were doing was right, that it was part of God's plan. Grace found herself staring out the window for hours at a time, watching the small, quiet town of Charleston Ridge unfold in front of her. The sun would rise over the old church steeple, and she would watch the townspeople gather for service, just as they always did. The sounds of hymns and prayers filled the air, and for a fleeting moment, Grace wondered if she could ever be part of it again. Could she ever stand in the pews with her parents, her hands folded in prayer, and truly believe in what they were all so steadfastly devoted to? Could she ever look at Pastor Johnson the same way again, with reverence and trust? Or would the truth always be there, staring at her, reminding her of how she had been deceived? It wasn't just Pastor Johnson she had to worry about anymore. It was everyone. The town was a small, close-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business. And once a secret like hers began to unfurl, there was no telling how far it would spread. The thought of her parents finding out that she had been looking through Pastor Johnson's papers, that she knew everything, filled her with dread. She couldn't imagine their reaction. They would be devastated. They had always looked at her as their pride and joy, the daughter who had been chosen. They wouldn't understand why she felt the way she did. They would only see her rebellion as a betrayal of their faith, and perhaps of them. As the days passed, Grace's unease only deepened. She couldn't continue living this lie, couldn't pretend everything was okay, especially when the truth was burning inside her like a fire she couldn't extinguish. But she was trapped. She didn't have anywhere to go. There was no one she could turn to. The town would never believe her. Pastor Johnson was the pillar of the community, a man of God whose word was unquestioned. No one would ever take the side of a girl who dared to challenge him, not in Charleston Ridge. And so, Grace stayed silent. She kept her thoughts to herself, the knowledge of what she had uncovered weighing on her shoulders like an invisible burden. But the silence was maddening. It gnawed at her, ate away at her from the inside. Every day felt like an endless cycle of pretending, of keeping up appearances. She would smile at her parents, nod politely when the pastor came by for his weekly visits. But inside, she was dying. She was suffocating in a world of her own making, one where the truth could never be spoken. But then, something changed. It started with Sister Rebecca, the pastor's wife. She had always been a distant figure in Grace's life. Grace had never paid much attention to her, always seeing her as a mere accessory to the pastor, a woman who stood by his side during church services, who played her role with quiet devotion. But as Grace's world began to unravel, she noticed something strange. Sister Rebecca wasn't as unaffected as she had seemed. One evening, as Grace was preparing dinner in the kitchen, she heard a soft knock on the door. It was late, too late for a normal visit, and Grace's heart skipped a beat when she saw who it was. Standing in the doorway was Sister Rebecca, her face pale, her eyes wide with something Grace couldn't quite place. "Grace," Sister Rebecca said, her voice trembling slightly. "May I come in?" Grace stepped aside without a word, her mind racing. She hadn't expected this. She had barely spoken to Sister Rebecca in the past few months, and now here she was, standing in their doorway, looking like a ghost. Sister Rebecca entered the house, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't sit down immediately, instead looking around the room, almost as if she were searching for something. The silence between them was thick, heavy, like something unspoken hung in the air, just beyond reach. Finally, Grace couldn't take it anymore. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice soft. Sister Rebecca hesitated before speaking. "Grace, I need to talk to you. About everything. About what's been happening." Grace felt a chill run down her spine. About what's been happening? What could she possibly mean? The pastor's visits? The union? The lies? Or something else entirely? "I don't know what you're talking about," Grace said, her voice trembling with uncertainty. But inside, she already knew. She had a sinking feeling in her stomach that Sister Rebecca knew, or at least suspected, the truth. "I think you do," Sister Rebecca replied quietly. "I think you know exactly what I'm talking about." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "The things he's done, Grace. The things he's done to me, to others." Grace's heart skipped a beat. The words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and for a moment, Grace couldn't speak. Sister Rebecca's eyes met hers, and Grace saw something there. Something dark, something broken. "You're not the first," Sister Rebecca continued, her voice cracking. "You won't be the last. He's done this before. He's done it to others, and I was one of them. He's used us, Grace. He's used his position to manipulate, to control. I don't know how to explain it. But I want you to know. I know what you're going through. And I am so sorry. I am so sorry for what you've been made to believe." Grace felt the air leave her lungs. For the first time, she wasn't alone in this. For the first time, someone else understood. Sister Rebecca took a step closer, her voice barely audible. "I never agreed to this, never. But he twisted everything, Grace. He made me believe it was God's will. And now I see what's happening, what he's doing to you." Tears filled Sister Rebecca's eyes as she reached out and took Grace's hands in hers. "You have to get away. You have to leave, Grace. He's not who he says he is. I've been too afraid to speak up. too afraid of what might happen if I did. But I can't let you go through what I went through. Please, you have to find a way to escape." The words hit Grace like a tidal wave. She had been carrying the burden of silence for so long, and now, here was someone who had lived through the same nightmare, telling her that it was okay to speak, to break free. "Rebecca, I don't know what to do," Grace whispered. "I don't know how to get out of this. He's everywhere. He has everyone on his side. My parents, they'll never believe me." "You have to find a way," Sister Rebecca said firmly. "You have to be strong, and you're not alone anymore. I'm here. You don't have to do this alone." For the first time in weeks, Grace felt a glimmer of hope. The weight of the truth was still heavy, still suffocating, but now she had someone who would stand by her. And that, in itself, was a kind of freedom. The weight of fear. Grace stood by the kitchen window, the pale light of the afternoon sun filtering through the thin curtains. It should have been peaceful. The quiet of the town outside, the stillness of the room, but in her heart, she felt only a gnawing dread. The conversation with Sister Rebecca had left her feeling conflicted. Part of her wanted to believe, to find the courage to leave. But another part of her felt paralyzed by the fear of what would happen if she did. Everything had changed, yet nothing had changed. She was still trapped. Every night, when the house fell into darkness and her parents went to bed, Grace would sit up in her room, her thoughts spinning endlessly. The quiet in her small room was overwhelming, a constant reminder that she had nowhere to turn. Her parents, in their blind faith, still believed in Pastor Johnson. They still believed that everything was happening according to God's plan, and Grace was the one who had been chosen to fulfill it. To defy that, especially to defy the authority of the pastor, who was so revered by everyone in Charleston Ridge, felt like a betrayal that was too vast to comprehend. In the days following the conversation with Rebecca, Grace had become more withdrawn. She couldn't look at her parents the same way anymore. Their blind devotion to Pastor Johnson felt like a betrayal in itself. The man they revered, the man they trusted, was the one who had manipulated her, the one who had twisted their faith to control them all. The worst part was that they couldn't see it. They couldn't see what was happening right in front of them. Pastor Johnson wasn't a messenger from God. He wasn't a man of faith. He was a predator, a man who had been using his position for years, preying on vulnerable young girls like Grace. And now, she was the next one in line to be consumed. But even worse was the feeling of being trapped in a world that wasn't hers anymore. It wasn't just the pastor's actions that made her feel helpless. It was the town itself, the people in it, who would never believe her, who would never question the pastor. Grace had been raised to trust in the authority of the church, to believe in its power, its unwavering truth. To suddenly question that meant questioning everything. It meant shattering the illusion that had held Charleston Ridge together for so long. Her thoughts often turned back to the other girls, the ones before her. She had read their names in the letters, heard their stories through the whispers of the town. Some of them had disappeared, moved away to other places, never to be heard from again. Others, like Sarah Ellen, had died under mysterious circumstances, their lives cut short in the name of Pastor Johnson's divine mission. And now, here she was, another girl on the list, another girl chosen for the pastor's twisted purposes. Grace couldn't help but wonder how long it would be before her name would be added to the list of girls who had been used and discarded. Would she too disappear one day? Would she too fade from the memory of Charleston Ridge, a silent casualty in a larger hidden war? Her body shook with the thought, her chest tightening in a panic that she couldn't escape. There was no way out. She had no power, no way to escape the tight grip of Pastor Johnson's influence. Even Sister Rebecca, who had once been so composed, was a shadow of the woman she used to be. Rebecca had confessed to Grace that she had tried to escape once, but it had been useless. The pastor had found her, dragged her back, and punished her for her defiance. She had been broken in ways that were hard to understand, her will shattered by years of manipulation. Grace felt like she was already there, standing on the edge of something terrible. She was too afraid to move forward, too afraid to stay where she was. Every step she took in the direction of freedom felt like it might be her last, and every moment she spent pretending everything was fine felt like another piece of her was dying. The fear consumed her. It wasn't just the fear of the pastor or of the consequences of leaving. It was the fear of losing herself, of losing everything she had ever known. If she spoke out, if she left, would she ever be able to return to the person she once was? Or would she be cast out forever, a pariah in the very town she had grown up in? Grace sat down on the edge of her bed, her hands pressed into her face as she tried to calm the rising tide of panic in her chest. She had to make a decision. She couldn't keep living in this limbo, this quiet desperation. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that she could just wait for the right moment to leave. The right moment might never come. If she didn't act now, she would be swallowed by this life, and there would be no escape. But how could she leave? Where would she go? She had no family outside of Charleston Ridge, no friends who could help her. And the idea of leaving with nothing, of facing the unknown, terrified her more than anything else. What would she do? How could she protect her children from a world that seemed so much more dangerous than she had ever realized? And then, as if a switch had been flipped, Grace made a decision. It was a simple thought, but one that carried the weight of everything she had been struggling with. I can't do this anymore. It was the truth that had been buried deep inside her, the truth she had been too afraid to face. She couldn't live in this prison anymore. She couldn't keep pretending. She wasn't just a victim in this story. She had to take control. She had to leave. She had to find a way to escape Pastor Johnson's grip, to protect her children and herself from the life that had been forced upon them. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be without risk. But it was the only choice she had left. Grace stood up, her legs shaking as she moved toward the door. The first step was always the hardest. But once she took that step, there would be no turning back. Her heart raced, the fear still gnawing at her insides. But now, there was something else, a spark of determination. She wasn't going to let this man define her life any longer. She wasn't going to let him take everything from her. With one last glance at the house she had once called home, Grace stepped out the door, ready to face whatever came next. The weight of the fear was still there, but for the first time, it wasn't all-consuming. For the first time, she felt like she had the power to fight back. A moment of rebellion. The decision was made. Grace's resolve had solidified as she took her first steps toward freedom, but the weight of it all hung heavily on her shoulders. The fear of the unknown, of what would happen if she failed, gnawed at her from the inside. But she couldn't let it stop her. She had spent too many nights awake, lying in the dark, wondering if there was a way out, wondering if there was a way to escape the suffocating grip of Pastor Johnson's power. Now, she was walking the path, and she had to keep moving forward. She couldn't let anything, not even fear, hold her back. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about her children. It was about their futures, their safety, their innocence. She couldn't let them grow up in the shadow of this man, trapped in the lies and manipulation that had been imposed on them all their lives. She would find a way to break free, no matter the cost. Grace began to make her plans in secret. She couldn't let anyone see the cracks forming in the perfect facade she had built around herself. Her parents, especially her mother, were still caught up in their blind faith. They would never understand if they knew what she was about to do. To them, leaving the pastor's side was unthinkable. He was a man of God, a figure they had trusted, revered, and believed in for years. But for Grace, the truth was undeniable now. He wasn't a man of God. He was a predator, and she couldn't stay silent any longer. But how would she do it? Grace had no money, no resources, no place to go. She knew she couldn't leave with her children without drawing attention to herself. It would have to be quiet. It would have to be fast. There was no room for hesitation. One evening, after a long, tiring day, Grace found herself alone in the kitchen. The house was still, her parents sitting in the living room, their voices a low murmur as they discussed the plans for the next church service. Grace's thoughts were consumed with the details of her escape. She had to be careful. She couldn't just walk out of the house. There would be questions, suspicions, and eventually the pastor would find out. No, she had to be subtle. It would take time, but she would do it. As she washed the dishes, her mind raced with ideas. She thought of the small things she could pack without raising suspicion. Clothing, of course, for herself and the children. But what else? There were a few $100s hidden in a drawer in her mother's room, money her mother had saved for a rainy day. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to get her started. She could take it without her parents noticing. They never went into that drawer. They trusted her. The hardest part was going to be leaving without a trace. Pastor Johnson was always around, always keeping tabs on everyone. Grace couldn't risk him finding out. But if she could slip away under the cover of night, when everyone was asleep, she might just have a chance. For the next few days, Grace moved like a shadow, slipping in and out of the house, making small preparations. She packed the few things she could carry, clothes for herself and her children, a few essential supplies, and the money she had taken. She also packed the most important item of all, the letters, the truth, the one thing that might save her, that might make others understand what had happened here, what had been done to her and the others before her. The letters were a risk, but they were also her weapon. If she could get to safety, they would be the proof she needed to expose Pastor Johnson for who he truly was. It wasn't until the night before her escape that Grace finally felt the full weight of what she was about to do. She stood in the quiet of her room, looking at her children as they slept, their innocent faces relaxed in peaceful slumber. How could she take them away from everything they knew? From their home? From their friends? From their family? Would they understand why she was doing this? Would they ever forgive her for the life they were about to lose? But deep down, Grace knew that she had no choice. She had to protect them. She had to protect herself. If she didn't act now, she would never get another chance. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Grace moved through the house like a ghost. She gathered the things she had packed, carefully slipping the bag under the bed so no one would see it. She kissed her children on the forehead, silently, so they wouldn't wake. They had no idea what was happening, and she wanted to keep it that way. This was a decision only she could make. The hardest part, though, was walking past her parents' room. Her heart clenched as she glanced inside. They were sleeping, their faces peaceful, unaware of the rebellion she was about to commit. How could she do this to them? How could she leave them, leave everything she had ever known? The guilt was overwhelming, but she pushed it aside. There was no time to second-guess herself. The moment had come. Grace moved to the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a deep breath, One last look at the house that had been her home for so long, and stepped outside into the cool night air. The streets were quiet, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the trees. She moved quickly, her footsteps soft on the gravel, as she made her way to the small shed at the edge of the yard. Inside, she had hidden the things she needed for the journey: her children's coats, a few extra pairs of shoes, and the small amount of money she had saved up over the years. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. As she reached for the door to the shed, her breath caught in her throat. The night air seemed to still, the world around her frozen in time. For a moment, she thought she had heard something. Footsteps, maybe. She held her breath, listening. But all was quiet. It must have been the wind. Grace opened the door and stepped inside, grabbing the bag she had packed. She carefully fastened it over her shoulder, checking to make sure everything was in place. The last thing she needed was to be caught with something she shouldn't have. Then, she glanced back toward the house, the light from the kitchen window casting a faint glow on the yard. She knew it wouldn't be long before they woke up, before they realized she was gone. With a final glance over her shoulder, Grace stepped into the darkness of the night. Her heart was pounding, her mind racing with fear and excitement. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't alone anymore. She had made her choice, and now there was no turning back. A mother's strength. The darkness of the night swallowed Grace as she stepped away from the familiar confines of her home. The gravel crunched beneath her feet, each step heavy with the weight of the decision she had made. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to return to the safety of the life she had known, even if that life had been nothing more than an illusion of safety. But there was no going back now. She had taken the first step toward freedom, and she couldn't allow herself to be consumed by doubt. Her heart raced as she glanced over her shoulder one last time. The house, her parents' home, stood behind her, its windows dark, casting no light into the night. She had left them all behind, without so much as a goodbye. She couldn't risk them waking up and stopping her. Couldn't risk Pastor Johnson coming after her. The past few days had been filled with secrets and careful movements. Her thoughts focused solely on escaping the web that had been spun around her life. But now, in the stillness of the night, the gravity of what she was doing began to settle in her chest like a heavy stone. Grace's thoughts turned to her children, who slept soundly in their beds. Her heart ached at the thought of what she was putting them through. She had told herself that it was for their safety, that she was breaking free for their future, so they wouldn't have to grow up in the shadow of Pastor Johnson's control. But the truth was, she wasn't sure if they would ever understand. How could they? How could they understand that their mother had risked everything to protect them, to give them a chance at a life free from the darkness that had tainted her own? She pulled her coat tighter around her body, the wind biting at her skin as she hurried through the streets of Charleston Ridge. It was late, but the town was never truly quiet. The hum of the old streetlights and the occasional rustling of leaves in the trees were the only sounds she heard. Grace knew the path ahead would not be easy, but it was the only choice she had. Her mind raced as she thought of the places she could go. There was no one she could turn to in Charleston Ridge. Her parents had cut ties with everyone who wasn't part of the church, and Pastor Johnson had made sure that no one in the town ever questioned his authority. She had no family outside of Charleston Ridge, no close friends who could take her in. The thought of starting over in a new place, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the small amount of money she had taken from her mother's stash, was both terrifying and liberating. She couldn't stay in Charleston Ridge. She couldn't let Pastor Johnson find her. There was one place, however, that offered her the faintest glimmer of hope. Her aunt, Rachel. Rachel had always been a quiet, gentle woman, living a modest life in the neighboring town of Briarwood. They hadn't seen each other in years, not since Rachel had moved away from Charleston Ridge to escape the suffocating influence of the church. But Grace remembered her fondly, and in the depths of her heart, she knew that Rachel was the one person who might take her in, even though the risks were high. With every step, the fear in Grace's chest tightened. She had no idea what she would find when she reached Briarwood. She didn't know if her aunt would even recognize her, let alone help her. The world she had known was gone, and now she was stepping into the unknown with nothing but the promise of a better life for her children. Her resolve strengthened with each passing moment. As long as she had her children, as long as they were together, she could face whatever came next. She had made it this far, and she wasn't going to stop now. As the hours passed, the town of Charleston Ridge faded behind her. The streets became quieter, the lights dimmer, as she left the confines of the town she had once called home. She could feel the weight of her decision pushing against her with every step. But there was also a sense of liberation. She was no longer tethered to the life that had been forced upon her. She was free, even if just for a moment. The road to Briarwood was long, but Grace knew she couldn't stop. She had to keep moving, for herself and for her children. The thought of turning back was unbearable. After what felt like an eternity, the first signs of daylight began to peek over the horizon. The sky shifted from deep indigo to pale pink, the sun's rays slowly stretching over the landscape. Grace hadn't stopped to rest. Her determination fueled her every move. She couldn't afford to stop, not until she knew she was safe. And as the daylight broke, she allowed herself a brief, shallow breath. The journey had been harder than she had imagined. Her legs ached, her feet were sore from the miles she had walked in the darkness. But she kept going. The path ahead was still unclear, but Grace knew that she couldn't turn back. Briarwood was still a few miles ahead, but she could almost feel it calling her, a beacon of hope in the distance. She could picture Rachel's small cottage, the overgrown garden that she had always tended with care, the smell of freshly baked bread wafting from the kitchen. It felt like a distant memory now, a piece of her old life, before all the darkness had consumed her. But there was no time to dwell in the past. She had to keep moving. When she reached the outskirts of Briarwood, Grace slowed her pace, her heart racing with uncertainty. She had no idea how Rachel would react. Would she recognize the woman standing before her? Or would the years of silence have erased her from her memory? What if she couldn't help? What if Pastor Johnson had found out and sent someone after her? But there was no more time for doubt. Grace had come too far to turn back now. She approached Rachel's house, her breath shallow, her pulse quickening in anticipation. Her children were sleeping soundly in her arms, exhausted from the journey, but Grace could feel them stir as they approached the door. With one last glance at her children, she knocked softly. The door creaked open, and Grace was greeted by a woman who looked much older than the last time she had seen her. Rachel stood there for a moment, taking in the sight of Grace, her eyes widening in recognition. "Grace?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Grace nodded, a sense of relief washing over her. She had made it. A fragile refuge. Rachel stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with surprise, disbelief, and something else, something that looked almost like fear. Grace could feel her heart pounding in her chest, a mix of relief and anxiety flooding her body. This was the moment. This was the place she had fought so hard to reach, but now that she was here, she wasn't sure if it was enough. Grace ... Rachel whispered again, her voice thick with emotion. She hadn't changed much, still the same woman who had left Charleston Ridge all those years ago. But there was a softness to her now, a gentleness that Grace could see in her eyes. Rachel had lived a quiet life. far from the chaos of the town that had once bound them all, far from the shadows that had consumed Grace's family. But could Rachel accept the life that Grace had left behind? Could she help? Grace could barely speak at first. She had so much she wanted to say, so many things she needed to explain. But as she looked into Rachel's eyes, she found herself overwhelmed with emotion. The last time they had seen each other, Grace had been just a girl, a child with a future ahead of her, one that had been taken away. Now she was a mother, a woman who had fought for her life and for the lives of her children. "I need your help," Grace finally managed, her voice shaking with the weight of it all. There's nowhere else to go. I had to leave." Rachel stepped forward, a look of concern spreading across her face. She didn't ask questions right away, didn't ask why or what had happened. She simply reached out and pulled Grace into her arms, holding her tightly. For the first time in so long, Grace felt safe. It was a fragile safety, one that could be broken in an instant, but it was safety nonetheless. "You're safe now," Rachel said softly, her voice filled with a quiet reassurance. "You're safe here. You can stay as long as you need." The words were like a balm on Grace's soul, soothing the raw wound that had been tearing at her heart for months. But as much as she wanted to believe them, there was a lingering fear. A fear that this, too, was temporary. That somehow Pastor Johnson's reach would extend even here, that Grace and her children would never truly be free. Rachel led them into the small cottage, the door creaking as it opened. The house was simple but warm. Grace hadn't realized how much she had missed the scent of fresh herbs and homemade bread. Rachel's kitchen was humble, with a wood-burning stove in the corner and a small table in the center. It was peaceful here, the quiet hum of nature outside, and the soft light that filtered in from the windows. Rachel motioned for Grace to sit at the table. "You must be exhausted," she said. "I'll make you something warm to eat. You and the children need rest." Grace nodded, too tired to protest, and took a seat at the table with her children. They were both asleep in her arms, their small, tired faces relaxed in peaceful slumber. She couldn't remember the last time they had truly rested. It felt like an eternity since they had been able to sleep without fear, without the constant pressure of living in a world controlled by someone else's rules. As Rachel moved about the kitchen, preparing food, Grace watched her, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. How had she ended up here, in this small cottage on the outskirts of Briarwood? How had it all gone so wrong? She thought back to the life she had once known, the life she had once dreamed of, full of possibilities and hope. She had never imagined it would come to this, that she would have to run for her life, to flee from the very people who had been supposed to protect her. She thought of Pastor Johnson, of the twisted way he had used faith to manipulate her, to trap her into a life she didn't want. How could she have been so blind? How had she allowed herself to be drawn into his web of lies? The answer was simple. She had been a child. She had trusted the people who were supposed to guide her. They had made her believe that everything they told her was the truth. And now, she was paying the price for that trust. "Grace?" Rachel's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. She had set a warm bowl of soup in front of Grace, the steam rising from it, filling the air with a comforting scent. "Eat. You'll feel better after you rest and eat something." Grace smiled weakly, her stomach growling at the sight of the food. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the aroma filled her senses. It had been so long since she had allowed herself to think about her basic needs, like food and rest. Her focus had always been on surviving, on protecting her children, on keeping one step ahead of the danger. "I don't know how to thank you," Grace said, her voice breaking slightly. "I never thought I'd have to leave. I didn't know what else to do." Rachel sat down beside her, a soft expression on her face. "You don't have to thank me," she said quietly. "I'm just glad you're here. I've been waiting for you, Grace. I knew you would come one day. I just didn't know when." Grace blinked in surprise. "You knew?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How?" Rachel's gaze softened. "I've been watching. I knew things weren't right in Charleston Ridge. I saw the signs, the way things were changing, how people were being controlled by Pastor Johnson. I knew he was dangerous. And when you left, I knew you had made the right choice. You just needed to find your way here." Tears filled Grace's eyes as she looked at her aunt. "I didn't know what to do," she whispered. "I thought I was losing my mind, but now I feel like I've finally found a piece of me again. I didn't know where to turn. But you've saved me." Rachel reached out and gently took Grace's hand. "You've saved yourself, Grace," she said softly. "It's not easy to leave everything behind, to walk away from the life you knew, but you're strong, and now you can start over. It's never too late." Grace felt a sense of relief flood over her. The fear was still there, the uncertainty still gripped her, but for the first time in a long while, she felt hope. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't trapped in the world Pastor Johnson had created for her. She had escaped. The next few days were a blur of quiet moments. Grace and her children settled into Rachel's home, the peaceful rhythm of everyday life offering a kind of solace that Grace had longed for. It wasn't much, just a small cottage and a simple life, but it was everything she had been searching for. It was the first taste of freedom she had ever known. But there was still one thing that weighed heavily on her heart. Pastor Johnson. She couldn't outrun him forever. He would come looking for her, and when he did, she would have to face him. She couldn't hide in the shadows forever. But for now, in the safety of Rachel's home, Grace allowed herself a moment of peace, knowing that she had taken the first step toward building a new life. The battle within days turned into weeks as Grace and her children settled into the quiet rhythm of life in Briarwood. The gentle, steady pace was a balm for her weary soul. She had never realized how much she needed rest, how much she needed to heal. In the stillness of Rachel's home, Grace found the time to process everything she had been through. The trauma of the past months, the fear, the manipulation, and the lies all swirled in her mind. Yet, for the first time, she had a safe space to breathe. For the first time, she felt like she was truly living, not just surviving. Her children were slowly adjusting too. They were still young, and their minds were more flexible, more adaptable than Grace's. They played in the garden outside, their laughter filling the air in a way that Grace hadn't heard in months. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. Her children were free from the fear, the control, and the suffocating atmosphere that had consumed their lives. And as long as they were safe, Grace could find peace. But as the days passed, the guilt began to creep in. Every time she looked at her children, she wondered if she had made the right choice. Could she have stayed in Charleston Ridge, fought back, exposed the truth there? Was it worth abandoning her parents, the people who had given her life, who had raised her in faith, only to find themselves caught up in the web of the pastor's manipulations? Grace often found herself sitting by the window, staring out at the peaceful countryside, wrestling with these thoughts. Had I betrayed them? Had I betrayed God? The guilt was sharp. She had walked away from everything, the community, the familiar faces, the life she had known. And though she had found safety here, She couldn't shake the feeling that she was running, always running from something. It wasn't just guilt over leaving Charleston Ridge. It was guilt over the years she had spent in ignorance, trusting the wrong people, allowing herself to be manipulated. Pastor Johnson hadn't just deceived her. He had deceived everyone around him, including her parents. And now that she had seen the truth, she couldn't help but feel that by running, she had abandoned them to face the pastor's wrath alone. Rachel noticed the change in Grace. She saw the faraway look in her niece's eyes, the way she seemed lost in thought, even when surrounded by the peace and safety of Briarwood. One evening after dinner, Rachel sat beside her at the kitchen table, her voice quiet but firm. "You've been through a lot, Grace," Rachel said softly, her gaze searching Grace's face. "You don't have to carry all of this by yourself." Grace sighed deeply, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of the table. "I don't know what to do, Rachel. I'm constantly fighting this feeling that I've made the wrong decision, that I've left my parents, my home, my faith behind. And I'm terrified that one day Pastor Johnson will find us and bring the world we've left behind with him." Rachel's hand gently rested on Grace's. "You're not the one who has abandoned them, Grace. Pastor Johnson has done that. He has led them down a dark path, and you were the one brave enough to walk away. No one should ever feel trapped in the name of faith. What you did wasn't a betrayal, it was a fight for survival. And you did it for your children." The words resonated deep within Grace. She wanted to believe them, wanted to believe that she had done the right thing. But the fear, the guilt, clung to her like a second skin. "But what about my parents? What about my mother? She believes in him. She believes that this is God's will. She's so proud of what she thinks I'm doing. How can I undo that? How can I tell her the truth without tearing everything apart?" Rachel gave her a small, understanding smile. "You can't undo it, Grace. What's done is done. But you can tell her the truth. When the time is right, you can tell her. She'll understand eventually. She may not see it now, but the truth has a way of breaking through, even the thickest walls." Grace nodded slowly, the weight of Rachel's words sinking in. There was no way to undo the past, but maybe there was a way to heal it. Slowly, piece by piece. The fear still churned in her gut, and the guilt still threatened to overwhelm her. But there was something else now, a glimmer of hope, a sense of purpose. She wasn't just running anymore. She was building something new. She was fighting for a future for her children, for herself, for all of them. But that didn't mean the road ahead would be easy. Every day was still a battle, both within and without. Grace knew that Pastor Johnson wouldn't just let her go. He wouldn't stop searching for her, and the fear of what would happen when he found her, the consequences for her, for Rachel, for the children, was something she couldn't escape. That night, after the conversation with Rachel, Grace lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The room was dark, the only light the faint glow of the moon through the window. Her children slept soundly, their breathing soft and rhythmic. Grace turned over, watching them for a moment, before closing her eyes and whispering a prayer into the silence. She didn't know if her prayer would be answered. She didn't know if there was anyone left to listen. But she prayed for strength. She prayed for wisdom. And most of all, she prayed for peace. Peace for herself, peace for her children, and peace for the broken pieces of her past. The next morning, Grace awoke early, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. Her mind was already racing with plans. There was so much to do, so much to figure out. The thought of Pastor Johnson still loomed over her like a dark cloud, but there was a new resolve in her heart. She wasn't going to run forever. Rachel had told her to focus on the future, on building something new. And that was exactly what she was going to do. She couldn't live in fear, not for the rest of her life. She couldn't let him win. Grace stood up, her legs stiff from the restless night, but there was a fire in her chest now. She was going to fight. She was going to protect her children, and she would find a way to take back her life. She wasn't going to let the darkness win. Not this time. And with that thought, she took her first step toward the future, toward the unknown, with a newfound strength and courage that came from within, because she was not just a victim anymore. She was a survivor. The path forward. The days after Grace's resolve hardened into a plan felt like a strange, cautious kind of peace. She woke up early every morning, watching her children sleep, their small faces peaceful, untouched by the darkness she had been running from. It was both comforting and painful, because every day she spent in Briarwood felt like a step further from the life she had once known, but it also felt like a step closer to something she had desperately longed for. Freedom. Rachel had been her anchor through these turbulent weeks. She could see the fear that still clung to Grace, the shadows in her eyes that spoke of nights spent wrestling with the decisions she had made and the consequences that might come with it. Yet, Rachel never pressed Grace to talk about it. She gave her the space to heal, to rest, and the quiet support of her presence was enough. It was all Grace needed for now. But Grace knew that her peace was fragile. The question of what came next had been simmering in her mind since that first night of her escape. How long could they remain hidden in Briarwood? How long before Pastor Johnson or someone loyal to him came looking for her? She couldn't stay in the shadows forever. She would have to confront the truth eventually. But how? How could she possibly expose the pastor's treachery without the whole town, and especially her parents, turning on her? The weight of the decision pressed down on her like an invisible stone lodged in her chest. Every day, the reality of her situation became clearer. She could not stay in hiding forever. Grace had to make a choice: fight for her freedom or return to the life she had once known, knowing full well it meant living under the control of Pastor Johnson and continuing to allow her children to grow up in a world that was nothing but lies and manipulation. One morning, as she sat at the kitchen table, her mind racing with thoughts of escape, Rachel entered with a steaming mug of tea and a quiet smile. The peace in the cottage was broken only by the occasional bird call outside. The world seemed so still, so removed from the chaos Grace had left behind. She took the mug gratefully and watched Rachel sit down across from her. "You've been quiet these past few days," Rachel said gently, studying Grace's face. "I can tell something's weighing on you." Grace stared into her tea, not knowing where to begin. There was so much to say, but the words felt trapped in her throat. How could she explain the turmoil she felt? How could she put into words the fear that kept gnawing at her, the constant dread of being found? "I can't stay here forever, Rachel," Grace said at last, her voice trembling. "I can't keep running. I have to do something." Rachel's expression softened, and she nodded in understanding. "I've known that for a while now," she said quietly. "You can't hide forever. But what are you planning to do?" "I don't know," Grace admitted, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't know if I'm strong enough. If I can confront them. If I can confront him." Rachel reached across the table, her hand covering Grace's. "You're stronger than you think, Grace. I've watched you from the moment you arrived here. Every step you've taken, every decision you've made. You've fought for your children. You've fought for your freedom. And I believe that you can keep fighting. But the choice is yours. You can stay here, find a new life, or you can go back and fight for what's right. But either way, you're going to have to face the truth." The truth. Grace had been running from it for so long, trying to escape it by hiding in the safety of Rachel's cottage, by shielding herself and her children from the dangers of the past. But as Rachel spoke, Grace realized that the truth was what had brought her here in the first place. The truth had been her salvation. It was time to stop hiding. "I don't know where to start," Grace whispered, looking down at her hands. "How do I even begin to expose him? How do I stand up to him when he's controlled everyone? When he's made everyone believe he's infallible?" Rachel's voice was calm, but firm. "You start by speaking your truth. You have the power to change things, Grace. You've seen what he's done, and you know that he's not the man everyone believes him to be. You don't have to fight this alone." Grace nodded slowly. For the first time since she had left Charleston Ridge, a small spark of courage began to kindle inside her chest. She had always been afraid of Pastor Johnson's power, afraid of her parents' reaction, afraid of losing everything. But Rachel was right. She had already lost so much. She had nothing left to lose. And now, she had the truth on her side. In the days that followed, Grace began to make plans. It wasn't enough just to speak out against Pastor Johnson. She needed to gather evidence, to tell the stories of the girls who had come before her. She needed to make sure that what had happened to her didn't happen to anyone else. With Rachel's help, Grace contacted a few trusted people from her past. People who had witnessed the pastor's behavior but had been too afraid to speak up. Some of them had seen the way he manipulated young girls, how he had used his position to control them. Grace knew they had to be brave enough to come forward with their stories, to stand beside her and tell the truth. It wasn't easy. Many of them were still scared of retribution, scared of being branded as traitors. But as Grace spoke to them, her voice steady, her heart full of determination, they began to see that their silence had only perpetuated the cycle of abuse. Together, they made plans to take their stories to the authorities. Grace didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if the town would believe her, if Pastor Johnson's influence would be enough to silence them all. But one thing was certain. She was no longer afraid. The truth had given her a strength she hadn't known she possessed. And now, she was going to fight for her freedom, for her children's future, and for the girls who had been silenced for too long. Rachel was right. She wasn't alone anymore. The past had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. The journey ahead would be difficult, but Grace knew it was the only way to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. And with every step she took, she would take back a piece of herself. For the first time, Grace felt a sense of hope. The kind of hope that comes from knowing you are doing the right thing, no matter the cost. The breaking point. The weeks that followed Grace's decision to take action felt like a roller coaster of emotions. She had never imagined that standing up for herself and her children would require so much courage, so much heartache. The weight of the truth had already taken its toll, and now, as Grace prepared to expose Pastor Johnson's lies, the fear was starting to creep back in. Grace had spent countless hours going through the letters, collecting testimonies from people who had witnessed the pastor's manipulations. Each story confirmed what she already knew. Pastor Johnson had built a kingdom of lies on the backs of vulnerable young girls. And every moment that passed, every hour she spent in Rachel's home, the pressure to do something, to act, grew stronger. Rachel was still by her side, offering quiet encouragement. But Grace could see the uncertainty in her aunt's eyes. She had never imagined her life would become entangled in the dangerous web of Charleston Ridge's pastor, nor could she fully grasp the magnitude of what was at stake. But Rachel, like Grace, understood the need to fight for truth, no matter the cost. Every conversation with her small group of allies left Grace with a bitter sense of urgency. They were all in this together, but their collective fear made the truth even harder to bear. Some of them had been so conditioned to stay silent, so broken by years of manipulation, that it took everything they had to even speak out. Grace couldn't blame them. She, too, had spent years in the pastor's shadow, convinced that his word was the word of God, too afraid to question his authority. But now, she knew better. Grace's heart pounded in her chest as she thought about what she was about to do. She couldn't go back to Charleston Ridge, not yet. She couldn't face the town, couldn't face her parents, knowing what she knew. She couldn't let them continue to live under the pastor's control. But she had to expose him. It was the only way. Yet, with every passing day, the fear weighed heavier. The authorities in Briarwood were kind, and they had offered their support. But Grace knew that bringing down a man as powerful as Pastor Johnson wouldn't be easy. He had supporters in Charleston Ridge, people who would defend him no matter what. People who believed that what he had done was not only acceptable, but necessary for their faith. Grace had to find a way to tell her story without endangering herself or the people who had stood by her. It was a delicate balance. One wrong move, and everything could fall apart. But she couldn't stay silent anymore. She couldn't let the pastor continue to prey on the innocent, to hide behind his position, and use faith as a weapon. Late one night, as the house settled into an eerie quiet, Grace sat by the window, watching the stars twinkle in the dark sky. The night felt endless, filled with possibility and dread in equal measure. Her children slept soundly in the next room, their small bodies curled up beneath the covers. They had no idea of the war Grace was fighting, the battle she had taken on to protect them. They had no idea what lay ahead. As the minutes passed, Grace's mind wandered back to her parents, to her mother, who had raised her with such care, with such love, only to have it all twisted by the pastor's influence. Grace had been her pride and joy, the daughter who was meant to do great things in God's name. How could she face her now? How could she ever explain why she had left? Why she had chosen to expose the man she had once revered? Grace squeezed her eyes shut, willing the tears away. It hurt too much. Her heart ached with the weight of the truth, the pain of knowing that she had broken her parents' trust, that she had shattered everything they had believed in. But what else could she have done? What other choice had she had? The tears came anyway, silent and bitter, as Grace sat there in the dark, holding the truth in her heart like a heavy stone. She had to let it out. She had to expose the lies, no matter the cost. That morning, after a sleepless night, Grace woke with a renewed sense of purpose. The plan was already set in motion. She had arranged to meet with a few trusted allies from her past. They would accompany her to the authorities, help her tell the story she had been too afraid to share for so long. She didn't know what would happen after that, but it was time to stop living in fear, to stop hiding from the truth. Her children were still asleep when she gathered her things. Letters, testimony, everything she had worked so hard to collect. Her hands shook as she folded the papers, as she looked at the pictures of her children, their innocent faces so unaware of the storm swirling around them. She wanted to protect them, to shield them from this world of darkness, but there was no going back now. If she wanted to build a better future for them, she had to take this final step. As she prepared to leave, Rachel appeared in the doorway, her face full of concern. Grace could see the fear in her aunt's eyes, the worry about what might come next. But there was also something else. Something like pride. "You don't have to do this alone," Rachel said quietly, walking over to where Grace stood. "I'm with you, Grace. Whatever happens, I'm with you." Grace felt a wave of gratitude wash over her, the words softening the harsh edge of the reality she was facing. She was not alone. Not anymore. With Rachel by her side, Grace walked out of the cottage and into the unknown. There was no turning back now. No more hiding. It was time to confront the man who had taken everything from her. Time to take back her life, her future, and her children's future. The journey ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Grace felt a sense of clarity. She wasn't running anymore. She was fighting back. And she would fight until the truth was heard, until Pastor Johnson could no longer hide behind his lies. Grace wasn't just doing this for herself anymore. She was doing it for every woman, every child, who had ever been manipulated or silenced. This was no longer just her battle. This was the battle for freedom, for justice, for the truth. The confrontation. The sun was just beginning to rise over Briarwood as Grace and Rachel made their way to the town center. The streets, usually quiet in the early hours, were still and empty. The light from the rising sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. But for Grace, the beauty of the morning seemed distant, as though it belonged to another world. She had spent so many years hiding in the shadows, and now she was stepping into the light with the truth in her hands. But the truth came with a heavy cost. Rachel walked beside her, her presence a quiet strength, but Grace could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. It wasn't just the physical journey to the authorities' office that had her heart racing. It was the emotional toll, the fear of what would happen next, the uncertainty of how the world she had known would react to the truth she was about to tell. She had walked away from Charleston Ridge to escape the lies, but the truth would always be a part of her now. As they reached the building, Grace's hands trembled. She wasn't sure if it was from fear or from the adrenaline of the moment, but she could feel the anxiety rising in her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This was it. There was no turning back. Rachel's hand brushed her shoulder, offering silent reassurance. "You've got this, Grace," she whispered. "Whatever happens, you're doing the right thing." Grace nodded, her throat tight. The weight of the words was almost too much to bear. Doing the right thing. Was she? Could she really undo the damage that had been done? Could she expose Pastor Johnson without destroying everything in her wake? The thought of her parents finding out, of them hearing the truth and realizing the role they had played in her suffering, twisted something deep inside her. But the truth was bigger than any fear she could feel. It was bigger than the years of silence, the years of being controlled. It was bigger than Pastor Johnson's lies. It was the truth, and it was the only thing that could set her free. They walked into the office together, Grace's heart hammering in her chest. A receptionist looked up, offering a polite smile, but Grace could see the recognition in her eyes. Grace wasn't a stranger here. She had come in the past with her parents, in times of need. But now, she was here to ask for something much bigger than just a simple favor. The receptionist gestured toward a door at the back of the room. "You can go on in," she said. "The detective is expecting you." Grace gave a small nod and followed Rachel down the narrow hall. Her thoughts raced, her mind swirling with the emotions of the past weeks. The detective, Officer Williams, had been the one to offer her support. He was the one who had been quietly investigating Pastor Johnson, watching for signs of wrongdoing. Grace had confided in him about the pastor's manipulations, about the lies and deceit that had clouded her life. She had never expected him to take her seriously, but he had. And now, here they were. The door opened to a small office, and Officer Williams stood up from behind his desk, offering a warm, if slightly tired, smile. "Grace," he said. "Rachel, glad to see you both. Please take a seat." Grace sat down across from him, Rachel beside her. The air in the room felt thick, like a storm was brewing. But it wasn't just fear that had her on edge. It was the sense that the moment had arrived. This was it. The truth she had kept hidden for so long was about to be told, and she had no idea what would happen after that. Officer Williams settled into his chair, his expression serious but compassionate. "Grace, I know this isn't easy for you," he said, his voice calm. "But you're not alone in this. We're going to take this one step at a time. What you're about to tell me is important. Your story matters." Grace nodded, swallowing hard. She had to do this. She had to find the courage to speak the words that had been buried inside her for so long. She had been silenced for too long. She couldn't let it continue. She looked up at Officer Williams, her voice shaky at first, but gaining strength with every word. "Pastor Johnson, he's been lying to everyone. He's been using his position to manipulate girls, to control them, to make them believe they're chosen for something divine, something sacred. He used me. He used me in a way I can't explain. I didn't understand it at first. But I know now. And I know he's done it to others too." Grace's words hung in the air, the room suddenly feeling smaller, tighter. She could see the shock in Officer Williams' eyes, the weight of what she was saying beginning to sink in. But he didn't interrupt her. He just listened, allowing her to speak, allowing her to finally tell her truth. "I thought I was special," Grace continued, her voice growing steadier. "I thought I was doing something good, something holy. But it was all a lie. He made me believe it was God's will. And now I see how many others he's hurt, how many lives he's destroyed." Rachel squeezed Grace's hand, offering silent support. Officer Williams leaned forward, his face softening with understanding. "Grace, what you've just shared, it's a lot. But I want you to know that you're doing the right thing. This isn't just about you. This is about exposing a pattern, a system. If what you're saying is true, and I believe you, it's going to change things. But you're not doing this alone. We'll help you every step of the way." Grace took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words settle in. This was it. The truth was out. There was no going back. "I'm not sure what comes next," she said quietly. "But I know I can't keep living in fear. I can't keep pretending that everything is okay when I know the truth." Officer Williams nodded. "We'll take this one step at a time. But the truth has a way of coming to light. You've already taken the hardest step. Now we'll make sure your story is heard." As the conversation continued, Grace felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. For the first time, she wasn't fighting alone. She had come forward with her story, and now the pieces were falling into place. She wasn't just exposing a man, she was fighting for every girl who had ever been manipulated, for every person who had been made to believe that something was holy when it was anything but. She had made it through the darkness, and now the light was starting to shine through. The road to redemption. The days following Grace's meeting with Officer Williams passed in a blur. For the first time in years, she felt like she was moving in the right direction, like she was no longer running, no longer hiding. The truth had been set in motion, and now there was nothing left to do but wait for the inevitable storm that would follow. But as much as she feared the consequences, she knew that there was no turning back. This was the only way forward. This was the only way to reclaim her life, to give her children the future they deserved. The small town of Briarwood was quiet, its streets still and unassuming, but Grace could feel the weight of the change in the air. She had exposed Pastor Johnson, and now it felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for the fallout. She knew that the battle was far from over. Pastor Johnson was powerful, and he had supporters, people who believed in him without question, people who would do anything to protect him. But Grace also knew something else now. The truth could never be silenced forever. It was strange, in a way, the quiet that had settled over her and her children. They no longer lived in constant fear of discovery, of being found. They were free, in a sense, free to live their lives without the shadow of the pastor's control hanging over them. But the road to freedom hadn't been easy. It had taken everything: courage, pain, and sacrifice. And even now, as the dust began to settle, Grace knew that the hardest part was yet to come. The first call came late one evening. Grace had just put her children to bed, the house quiet except for the soft sounds of their breathing. She was sitting in the living room, her mind racing with thoughts of what had happened so far and what was still to come. The phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. She hesitated for a moment, then picked it up. "Grace?" The voice on the other end was familiar. It was Officer Williams. Her heart skipped a beat. "Yes, it's me?" "We've got news," Officer Williams said, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "Pastor Johnson is in custody. He's been arrested. We found the evidence, the ledger, the testimonies. Everything checks out. And now, we're moving forward with the charges. It's over, Grace. He won't hurt anyone else." A rush of relief flooded Grace's chest, followed by an overwhelming wave of exhaustion. It was finally happening. Pastor Johnson, the man who had controlled so many lives, who had manipulated and abused with impunity, was being held accountable. Grace had never thought she would live to see this day. Tears welled up in her eyes as she listened to Officer Williams. She had spent so many years afraid of this moment, afraid that exposing the pastor would only lead to more suffering, more punishment. But now, in the quiet aftermath, it was clear that she had done the right thing. She had taken the hardest step, and now the truth was bringing justice. "Thank you," Grace whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for believing me, for helping us." "It was the least we could do," Officer Williams replied. "You've shown more courage than most could ever hope for. We'll keep you updated as things progress, but for now, take a breath. You and your children are safe." The call ended, and Grace sat there, staring at the phone in her hand. The weight of the moment settled over her, and she allowed herself to close her eyes for just a moment. She had done it. She had exposed the darkness that had consumed her life. And now, Pastor Johnson would pay for his crimes. The journey wasn't over, but it was a beginning. And for the first time in years, Grace felt the first stirrings of hope. Her children were safe. She was safe. And they were free to rebuild their lives, free from the chains that had bound them for so long. In the weeks that followed, the small town of Briarwood became the epicenter of a story that would change many lives. The investigation into Pastor Johnson's actions had shaken the foundations of Charleston Ridge and beyond. The townspeople, once blind to his manipulation, were now faced with the truth. Many of them, like Grace's parents, had been too deeply entwined in his web to see what he had been doing. But the evidence was irrefutable, and the testimonies of those who had suffered under his control could no longer be ignored. Grace's parents, when they finally learned the truth, were devastated. It was a painful process, one that tore at the fabric of their faith. Grace's mother had been the first to reach out to her, her voice soft and hesitant. "I didn't know, Grace. I didn't know what he was doing. I thought we were doing the right thing by following him. I never thought it could go this far." Grace had listened in silence, her heart torn between the love she still had for them and the anger she felt for their blindness. But the past couldn't be undone. They had all been victims of the same man, of the same lies. And in that moment, Grace realized something. Forgiveness wasn't just for the ones who hurt her. It was for herself, too. She couldn't carry the weight of the past forever. It was time to let go. "I know, Mama," Grace had said quietly, her voice steady. "I know you didn't know. But you need to understand now. You need to see the truth, just like I did." Her mother had cried, and for the first time in a long time, Grace had allowed herself to cry too. It wasn't about finding answers anymore. It was about healing. As the weeks turned into months, Pastor Johnson's trial unfolded. The truth came out in painful detail, but it was also liberating. Grace had given testimony, her voice strong, her words a testament to her strength. She knew it was her duty, not just to herself, but to every woman, every child who had been silenced, who had been broken by the same man. And in the end, justice was served. Pastor Johnson was convicted, sentenced to life in prison. His empire crumbled, and with it, the false image of holiness that he had built around himself. The town of Charleston Ridge, once so firmly under his control, began to heal. Grace, though, was no longer a part of that town. She had made Briarwood her home now, a place where she could rebuild, where she and her children could find peace. She had found strength in her struggle, and she had discovered a courage she never knew she had. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Grace knew one thing for sure. She would no longer be a victim of the past. She would no longer let fear control her. She was free. And for the first time in her life, Grace was truly beginning to live again. The key lesson from Grace's journey is the power of truth and the courage to face it, no matter the cost. Life can sometimes bind us in ways that feel impossible to escape, whether it's through fear, manipulation, or simply the weight of unspoken truths. But as Grace's story shows, breaking free begins with acknowledging the truth, even when it feels like the hardest thing to do. For those of us who have lived through decades of experiences, it's important to remember that we are never too old to make a change, to speak our truth, or to rebuild our lives. Whether it's healing from past pain or standing up for what is right, each day brings a new opportunity for growth. Just like Grace, we may face challenges and fear the unknown, but the strength to change is always within us. The courage to confront difficult situations, the love for those we care about, and the hope that a better future lies ahead, these are the forces that shape the next chapter of our lives. Embrace them, and remember, it's never too late to start anew. We've walked through a journey of pain and triumph together. But this story doesn't end here. What happens next is just as powerful. Where are you watching from? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know how this story resonated with you. And don't forget to join us next time for more inspiring tales of resilience and strength. Until then, take care, and remember, there's always hope.